What's up, guys? I am coming at you from a highway in Hunan province for a little bit of an interim video. It's an interim video because my trip to Tibet, which so many of you guys had joined along for, is over. I actually finished it a couple of days ago, but I have a couple of videos that I still need to upload. The last two videos. First of which is a visit to the world's highest craft beer brewery, opened by a local Tibetan. And you guys can probably imagine how excited I was by that with my interest and involvement in craft beer. So that was a very tasty trip. And then the last video is with Xinjiang, the person you saw mostly in my videos in Tibet about journalism in China and just her job and some of the stories she covered. I really enjoyed that conversation, and in the video I also mentioned who my favorite underrated YouTuber is. So stay tuned for that too. I was hoping the last video would be a goodbye video at the airport, saying goodbye to all of my new friends when they were flying off back to Beijing, but I didn't get to do that, and I would have been even happy doing that off of camera, but it was so hectic and crazy at the airport. By the time I checked in and got to my gate, it's not a very big airport. I was looking around, couldn't see them. I sent them a message, hey, where are you guys? They already boarded their plane. So I didn't even get to say goodbye to them, which I was pretty sad about because, as you can imagine, we kind of became really close, like family, the whole group, and we learned a lot about each other over the 21 days. But, I'm sure I'll get to see them again. I go to Beijing once in a while. So those are what the last two videos are going to be, but I wanted to make this video in the meantime to acknowledge that I passed the 100,000 subscriber mark. The subscriber numbers isn't something I've really been paying much attention to or putting too much of an emphasis on. I never even say like and subscribe like most people do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But even so, it's hard not to be blown away by the fact that I started vlogging really in October last year. And now there are more people subscribed to my channel than there are people in the town that I grew up in. And 100,000 might not be a lot for some people, but for me, it feels surreal. I'm just kind of blown away by it. So I just wanted to send a shout out for that and a thank you and an acknowledgement. And I wanted to wait until I was a little bit above the 100,000 mark, because YouTube has a tendency to drop off some of my subscribers sometimes. I had people before constantly say, I have to keep resubscribing to your channel. I keep getting unsubscribed. So that would have looked pretty silly if I had a 100,000 subscriber recognition video and then I dropped down to the 90s. I think I'm in the safe zone now, but that's not for sure. We'll see. But anyways, I wanted to put this out there. A little bit about what I'm doing here. So when those guys flew back to Beijing, I flew to Wuhan via Chongqing. Some of you guys know I bought a RV. It's been ready for a while, and I would have picked it up if it wasn't for the Tibet trip. So that's the first thing I did. Flew to Wuhan, stayed near the airport overnight. Then my buddy, Hong Kong buddy, some of you have seen him on my channel before, showed up, and I was really excited to see him. It was kind of weird because I felt like I had an entire lifetime experience in Tibet, or at least that it was like a completely different world that I visited. And he was the first sign of my previous life, my old life. And I was happy to see him, and I'm going to be even happier, obviously, to see my family. I haven't seen them in over a month now. But at the same time, I'm having like kind of separation anxiety from Tibet. I look up at the clouds and they look so far away. I should say separation anxiety from the sky, because everything seems so far away now, whereas we were in the sky. We were living in the sky in Tibet pretty much. It's a weird feeling, but a great experience. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit more too, is my experience in Tibet. It wasn't my first trip to Tibet. My first trip to Tibet wasn't with a big group like that. Wasn't with a very well planned out itinerary. It was more random. But back then, I wasn't a vlogger yet. And a lot of my experiences relied on interactions with the camera off also. I feel like if you're going to go up and talk to local people randomly, like I did in my videos also, but if I did that all the time, I felt like you'd lose some of the organic or natural responses that you might get if you didn't have a camera in their face. So I wanted to make sure I reserved time for interactions like that as well, and also for just observing what's happening on the ground, how people interacted with each other, how people acted around the police also. I've got some interesting stories about that too. And one of my interactions, for example, in the supermarket, there was a girl who was asking me, where am I from? She was curious what I was doing there. And she, eventually in the conversation, I wanted to ask her, she's Tibetan, local Tibetan ethnic group. I said, do you like China? And without hesitation and very naturally, she said, yeah, of course I like China. I'm Chinese. And so that was really interesting to hear from an identity point of view about how she identified. But I really wanted to speak to people who were not happy too. No matter how difficult it was to find, an overwhelming number of the people I spoke to were happy with the direction that the country was taking. But of course there's going to be unhappy people. It would be illogical or naive to think that anywhere in the world has 100% of the people happy 100% of the time. There must be a way to find some people who are unhappy with their life situation or the government. And I did find one. And so the issue for him, which perhaps is unsurprising, is he says, okay, all right, so ethnic minority groups in China or non-Han ethnic groups in China, they get preferential treatment or entry into top universities. They can enter top universities easier. They weren't subject to the one-child policy. There's tax and business benefits for them. But why is it more difficult for us to get passports than Han Chinese? That's not fair. And he's right, it's not fair. It's absolutely not fair. And so I wanted to dig a little bit deeper to see how much of the context he understood. And this guy is very well informed. He watches Western news through a VPN. I guess I shouldn't say well-informed. I should say misinformed in the other direction. I think anybody who listens to only Western media thinking that they have a well-informed, well-rounded picture of China, they're also being very naive. But whatever, he gets both sides of the story. He's here, he gets the story here, and he gets the story overseas also. And from that, he can figure out maybe the truth lies somewhere in the middle. But anyways, I was curious about what he knew about the interference from the U.S. in Tibet. And he was very well aware of the CIA funding that started in 1958, $1.7 million a year, $170,000 directly to the Dalai Lama, $500,000 to set up training camps to radicalize Tibetans and create kind of Tibetan rebels who are going to come back and cause social unrest. He knew about all that, but he didn't care. He says, this has got nothing to do with him. If there's a Cold War between the U.S. and China, that's got nothing to do with him and his desire to get a passport. He can still get a passport, but it's a lot more difficult and he has to jump through a lot more hoops. So from his point of view, it's unfair. And it is. It is unfair to be an ordinary person stuck in the middle of that. But it's still important for people, whether it's him or people outside, to recognize that context. It doesn't necessarily mean that with that context you're going to come to a different conclusion. You may still put the blame 100% on the Chinese government, and that's fine, but that's still not a good reason to ignore the context to begin with. Personally, I think that there's definitely blame on, there definitely needs to be blame on forces that are trying to destabilize regions within China. But whatever, everybody's going to have their own opinion on that. That's not the most important point. One thing he didn't know about, and I think a lot of people probably don't know about, is that the Dalai Lama's brother in his book said that he really regrets having dealt with the CIA, and he thinks that if the CIA and America got their way, Tibet would be another Middle Eastern country like Afghanistan, Iraq, or Libya. And that's a pretty reasonable conclusion or assumption, considering we have enough of a track record behind us to realize that that's what happens. It's not really about creating circumstances that will improve the lives of people in the country. I mean, Libya is a good example. Libya was not a perfect country before, but it was one of the richest nations in Africa. It was going to create an African central currency that would have benefited all of Africa, which would have been gold-backed and potentially competed with the US dollar. But he was taken out, and now Libya has been freed. They have been liberated. It doesn't matter that now they are way less prosperous than they were before. It doesn't matter now that they are torn apart by various terrorist groups. It doesn't matter that they're trading African slaves in open markets. No, they've been liberated and they are now free. These are words that people use without actually thinking about the meaning of them, liberation, freedom, democracy, and without thinking about what actually happens when the US tries to spread these ideologies to other places. People don't think about that. But again, and I wasn't having a debate with this guy, because that would be really a kind of arrogant for me to think that I could debate him and say he is wrong and this is why he's wrong. That wasn't my purpose. I wanted to see how he reacted to this information. And for him, again, he acknowledges that, but from his perspective on the ground, that's not what matters to him. And fair enough. Fair enough. I would not be happy in his situation either if I wanted to see the world and I said, why is it more difficult for me to get a passport than anybody else? It doesn't matter about that context, but still, I value at least having that context. But it was an interesting experience. There are more things I'll talk about potentially in future videos or in a live stream. Some of the more interesting things too that I learned by talking to people inside and outside of China from different perspectives were the two things that the Dalai Lama says that people don't like to repeat. People who are on this anti-China kind of bandwagon, the two biggest things they hate hearing people repeat that the Dalai Lama himself said. The first of which is that he said that the Panchen Lama that he chose, so that's the child that went missing, the Panchen Lama that he recognizes. Panchen Lama is kind of the same level as the Dalai Lama in terms of spiritual importance. And he said that he knows from reliable sources that the Panchen Lama that he recognizes is fine and is receiving a normal education.
Then the Panchen Lama, which I recognize, some time back, you see no news, disappeared. But then, according reliable source, also the information, he is still alive and carrying, I think, normal education. So we'll see.
People who like to paint the picture that maybe he's been murdered by the Chinese Communist Party don't like you to repeat that, even though these are words that came from the Dalai Lama's mouth. The other thing that they don't like you to repeat is that the Dalai Lama said a couple of years ago that he thinks that Tibet should remain, or that Tibet could remain a part of China and benefit from its amazing economy as long as it had sufficient autonomy and religious freedoms.
Those area which Constitution itself recognized as a Tibetan area should have same right for preservation of our own culture, our own language. Then, okay, remain within the People's Republic of China. It's a mutual benefit. We will get benefit from Chinese economy, Chinese money.
And the interesting thing for me about that is not so much that people don't like you to repeat that, which is certainly true, but it's that in 1951, the Chinese government and him and the Tibetan government had an agreement, a 17-point agreement that more or less matches what he's saying he'd be okay with now. It's probably not exactly perfect. There are probably places where it doesn't exactly match what he's asking for now, but it's a lot better than what he's now. And so that was 1951. 1958 is when the CIA started funding these separatist groups, and then it was shortly thereafter the PLA came in and the Dalai Lama escaped. That was kind of when it seems like the government here put their foot down. Now, does it mean they wouldn't have eventually found an excuse to do the same thing anyways? I don't know, maybe. Maybe they would have done the same thing. But these are the facts that we're dealing with. These are the sequence of events and how it happened. And there's a precedent for this kind of a reaction to this kind of a cooperation with the U.S. government. Somewhat of a parallel I could draw is with Liu Xiaobo. He's the human rights lawyer who was put under house arrest before, and he's a guy, he wasn't a new kid on the block that all of a sudden started doing activism and immediately got swept away. He was at it for a long time. He was one of the guys who was on the ground in 1989 in Tiananmen Square with the student protesters. He was at it since then and before then for decades. But when did the Chinese government say, no, that's it, it's over? That was when he started getting NED grants and recognition and awards. So the NED is an NGO that's funded by the CIA. Because the Chinese government knows full well what happens to governments around the world after people start cooperating with organizations like that. It's usually very disastrous for the country and its people. You know, with Libya, even my mother's country in Guyana, they did the same thing. I've spoken about it on my channel before. A democratically elected president, which is important to note too, because it's not about whether people have democracy or not. It's about whether the U.S. government wants you to exist or not. So, democratically elected president, the Prime Minister Chetty Jagan, he was a little bit too friendly with the Soviet Union and had Marxist-Leninist leaning philosophies, and America didn't want another Cuba in the region. So they went in and started funding groups and created a racial conflict between the people of African descent and Indian descent in the country, and they started killing each other. And the racism that stemmed from that lasted a long time beyond that, even after people realized they were played. And these aren't conspiracy theories. These things they're declassified CIA documents. With the case of the funding, the $1.7 million that I mentioned before, that's available online also. There's a new organization that just recently started funding the Tibetan government in exile again. And on the NED website, there are over $3 million in grants allocated to activists or people working on the Tibetan cause. So this is how the government here reacts to those kinds of things. Again, some people may not think that it's a reasonable reaction, even in the face of what these things usually result in for the countries. But it's important to not ignore these kinds of things. Now, of course, Tibet is not really the focus of too much anti-China propaganda anymore. It seems to be popping up a little bit more. I don't know if that's just because I've surrounded myself in the topic a little bit more, but of course the big focus is on Xinjiang, and that's going to be something that I do a video about too. I've got a collaboration coming up where we really look at some of the propaganda that's being spewed out by the West on Xinjiang. And you know, I kind of understand why a lot of people, they look at a situation. This is shaking a bit here. All right, sorry, I just had a call that came in. That's gonna put a dent in my flow here. I think what I was talking about was, so I understand why people take a look at a situation, they gather as much information as they can, and they try to make an educated conclusion on what they think is going on. You know, it's impossible for us to really 100% verify anything in life. How can you make sure that something is true unless you see it with your own eyes? And even then, you could be wrong as well, depending on how you perceive it. However, in the case of geopolitical conflicts like this, there's a very good reason as to why we need to increase our threshold, why we need more evidence beyond an even bigger reasonable doubt that what we believe in is true. And the reason is because we've been fooled over and over again with these kinds of narratives from country to country. You know, whether it be in Iraq, the first Iraq invasion, which was very largely justified by the testimony by a 15-year-old girl who said Iraqi soldiers were coming into the hospital, taking babies out of incubators, throwing them on the floor and allowing them to die. Ended up being total BS. She ended up being hired. She was hired by a PR firm, and people were tricked into that. The second time, obviously, was the weapons of mass destruction lie. In Libya, there was a bunch of really crazy stories that were so ridiculous, I'll probably even get demonetized by even mentioning them, but they're clearly BS, but it happens over and over and over again. So because of that, when it comes to stories like this, we need to be more cautious and say, hold on a second, we need a little bit more information. Yet people don't do it, and they believe in the most crazy things. And these are the things that end up excusing military conflicts. They excuse events which end up killing so many innocent people. And we never learn from it. We never learn from it over and over again. There's a very sophisticated system in place to shame people who want to learn from previous instances like this. From people who want to say, hold on a second. And that methodology is to say, you are an apologist, or you're making excuses for an authoritarian government. This is like the go-to argument. No. You know who's making excuses? The people who are saying that are making excuses to not learn from the previous times they've been lied to. Those are the people who are making excuses for the potential conflict that is coming up. And those are the people making excuses for the people profiting from that fear-mongering greatly during this period of time. And I'll tell you one of those people, it's ASPI. So of course you have the big possible motive, establishing a motive for a crime. And in this case, the crime is spewing all this BS. The big motive is potentially justifying a conflict. And the risky thing is that, of course, a conflict with China is going to be far greater than any of these other conflicts that I was talking about. There could be serious consequences. But another motive is the people who are profiting in the meantime. You know, ASPI, these are one of the groups that have so many activists all over Twitter, journalists spewing this, you know, China fear-mongering story, yellow peril, whatever you want to call it. They're going crazy. And they are backed by the military-industrial complex. Companies like Raytheon, companies like Lockheed Martin, and I'll give you an example of how they've profited. So based on their fear-mongering, they managed to secure, ASPI managed to secure some deals for their backers of defense equipment for Australia to counter the China threat. And the even more ridiculous thing about that is that, so ASPI acted as the consultant for the government, saying, yeah, I think you should buy from our backers. Then ASPI also gets awarded a few $100,000 as the middleman fee from the government. The government also pays them to say, thank you for recommending the people who sponsor you. Here's some money for brokering the deal with us and the people who sponsor you. So they're getting double paid, basically. And all of the people, the taxpayers, are being just flossed and being taken advantage of, not only of their tax dollars, but to become complacent in what could be the next big conflict. It's the most ridiculous upside down thing in the world. I mean, there's so many other layers, and I'm going to be talking about this too. They're mostly focusing on the Xinjiang thing. You know, these countries like the US are sanctioning companies in Xinjiang who are hiring Uyghurs, local Uyghurs. They're regular workers being paid the same salary as everybody else, and they're sanctioning them, taking away the livelihood of Uyghurs. And this is actually a very strategic thing. This has been documented before, that when they go in and they make sanctions against places like Iran and Venezuela, what they're hoping to do is they're hoping to create suffering amongst the local population, to create discontent and causing them to rise up against their government. They're not relying on an organic event to happen. They're the ones who are instigating it and pushing it along. So they're doing that in Xinjiang right now, sanctioning all of these companies. But the second layer of irony is, during this time, they awarded a massive deal to Blackwater. It was one of these companies in the US, a huge contract to the company that was very largely responsible and involved in the Abu Ghraib incidents in Iraq, where they were torturing Muslims. So they are sanctioning companies in Xinjiang who they think are mistreating Muslims, while awarding billion-dollar contracts to companies who they know were responsible for torturing Muslims. But it's their own companies. And it's just, again, the world is upside down. I don't know how people can't look at this kind of stuff critically, but people are being taken advantage of, and they're being fooled over and over again, and they're not even willing to look at things critically. People are just, I would like to believe that most people are just being fooled, but I know there are some people who are very well aware of what they're doing. They just don't like to see the rise of a country that they have such a lifelong vested interest in hating, or, you know, are convinced that no, their system isn't supposed to work. It's really crazy. I mean, I witnessed some of it firsthand when I was posting some of my videos of Tibetans. You know, even before I got political on my trip, there was nothing political attached to it. Even posting a picture of a happy Tibetan would trigger people, because it would challenge their entire identity or their understanding of reality or their entire vested interest in believing that Tibet is a place of suffering. And the only thing that these people would have been happy with is seeing me walk away with photos of unhappy people or suffering or poverty. The most insulting thing to them is to see the opposite of that. That's the only thing that would have made them happy, is seeing suffering in Tibet. And the most recent thing, which is really funny, is So 21 days of coverage in Tibet, right? I've been to schools. I've had some candid, conversations with random people, like the kid at the top of base camp, or putting people on the spot and just asking random questions, like the girl at the school who I asked to explain that science experiment in Tibetan also. And that was interesting too, because a lot of people were saying, oh, it was totally staged. All those kids, they learned Tibetan calligraphy, Tibetan language, Tibetan music, Tibetan dance, typing in Tibetan into the computers. They learned it just for my visit. They weren't taught that before I arrived. It's like, come on, guys. But onto the recent story. So after all of that coverage in Tibet, there was a guy who went to, it was either Sichuan or Qinghai or somewhere, but it was an area with a large population of Tibetan ethnic grouped people. And he posts a random picture of a Chinese guy, a Han Chinese guy at his car and at the buffet, and says, I'm being followed by Chinese secret police. I've lost track of how many of these Free Tibet crowds sent it to me saying, you see, everything you said was BS. This random guy posted a picture of a random guy standing at a buffet in a hotel saying he's being followed. It completely negates your entire trip. This is how low the bar is for them. This is how low the threshold is for them to hold on to their understanding of reality. Oh, it's a bit shaky here. The camera's shaking a bit. Okay, I'm past the bumpy area there. But yeah, it was a really interesting experience, both on the ground and then seeing the reactions to some of the stuff. Very fascinating. And there's a lot of other stuff that I would like to talk about as well, which I will follow up with either in a live stream or separate videos. There's probably a bunch of stuff that I really wanted to talk about here. I will share some links with you guys about some of the stuff I was speaking about what the Dalai Lama's brother said, what the Dalai Lama said about the Panchen Lama, but I'll also share some historical stuff that I found interesting too. Because, obviously Tibet has been a part of China for, since the 1300s. Basically, like 400 or 500 years before the United States even existed as a country, half a millennia before the United States existed as a country. But a lot of people really like to talk about how in the in the early 1900s, that's when Tibet had independence for a short period of time. But there's a lot of stuff that runs contrary to that also, in terms of 1940s, even the 14th Panchen Lama himself was approved by the central Chinese government and the Qing dynasty, and they provided 400,000 of the local currency at that time for his celebration party, inauguration party, whatever you want to call it. And then earlier on in 1908, early 1900s, when the British invaded Tibet and slaughtered over 3,000 Tibetans, they also experienced some losses during their invasion, so they demanded war reparations. It sounds like something, that they would do back in that time. And it wasn't the Tibetan government that paid it. It was the central Qing dynasty government. It was, I think, 500,000 pounds at that time, which is obviously worth a lot more now. And why would that happen if there were two completely separate places? Of course, you could probably have a debate about, okay, well, exactly how did the relationship work? Was it semi-autonomous? All this stuff. But these are things that not many people talk about or even know about. So it's been a really interesting journey, and I look forward to talking about it a little bit more with you guys. But I'm just about to go through a toll booth here, and I have been rambling on for way longer than I thought I would. So I'm going to cut it off here, and I will see you in the next video. Peace.